celebrating the launch of McGill's new biodiversity plan, which has been the work of about a year and a half, trying to figure out how McGill can contribute to the broader goals that the international community has set for biodiversity, thinking about that institutionally, thinking about what the student community can do, how they can work with faculty and staff to sort of really advance McGill's sort of position on biodiversity and how we can protect nature better. And so the point of this talk series is really to share some of the work that's going on our different campuses. And today I decided to talk to you about work I've been doing for about the last 15 years on the problem of reconnecting our landscapes. And I'm going to explain what I mean by reconnecting our landscapes for biodiversity conservation during the course of this talk. But before I sort of launch into that, I want to take you to an image that I saw almost 30 years to the day. I was in an undergraduate class in conservation biology, and the professor put this figure up, this photo up. This photo is showing you two isolated fragments of the Brazilian rainforest. And at the time, he said, this is going to be the single biggest factor, the single biggest cause of extinction and loss of biodiversity worldwide for the coming decades. And he said to me at the time, we don't have a very good understanding of how habitat loss and habitat fragmentation, the creation of small parcels of habitat during the process of habitat destruction, how that is going to drive extinction into the future. And more importantly, we don't have a good theoretical, conceptual, or empirical understanding of what we can do to reverse the loss of biodiversity in landscapes that look like this. And landscapes that look like this don't just exist in the Brazilian rainforest. They exist in anywhere where humans have left a footprint to grow crops, to expand urban areas, to put down roads and other transport networks. So what I set out to do over the last 20 odd years since I've been at McGill, but even during my PhD back in 95, was to figure out how we could advance this. Let me just close that. How we could advance conservation science of fragmented communities, and also to think about how we could reconnect these landscapes. Fast forward 30 years, and a lot has changed in the science policy interface or the science policy world, where now we have, thanks to the agreement in Montreal last December at COP15, we have a new framework, a new plan, a new strategy for protecting biodiversity. And this new global biodiversity framework has 4 goals and 23 targets, each of which are designed to try to bend the curve of biodiversity. This is 1970, this is 2010, 2050, 2100. This is sort of an idealized depiction of how biodiversity is trending downward, and how under different scenarios of ambition, how society as a whole, both in Canada and in any country around the world, and collectively among countries, we can reverse this trend and set us on a course to a much more holistic and sustainable relationship with nature. Now, as I said earlier, it has 4 goals. Goal A is focused on the nature goals. Goal B is focused on the benefits we get from healthy ecosystems. Goal C is focused on the benefits, equitable sharing of those benefits, and to a first approximation. And Goal D is about the resources we need to mobilize to achieve these goals. Now, Goal A, this nature goal, has the keyword for this talk written throughout it. Goal A says the integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored. So that word connectivity is going to be crucial for this talk, and it has something to do with that structural fragmentation that I showed you in that image in the previous slide. And each goal has a number of targets associated with it. And targets 2 and 3 about how we will restore degraded ecosystems and how we are going to protect 30% of our land and sea area by 2030. And I put the text up here, not so that you spend time reading it particularly, but that you notice that the word connectivity and well-connected appear in the wording of those targets. So for the first time, these global agreements are focusing on this property of ecosystems and how organisms and other processes move between ecosystems as a vital component of what we should be achieving as a global community. So in this case, we want to protect 30%. We want to restore 30% of degraded lands, but we want to make sure they're connected. And in target 3, we want to protect 30% of our land and sea surface. We want to make sure that our protected areas are connected. How do we do that? How are we going to do that? That turns out to require a whole lot of science. So I'm going to tell you that story today. The first thing to point out is that the baseline, the starting point of where we are today, is that our protected areas are not connected. They're not connected in the sense that animals can move freely from protected area to protected area. So in this analysis, they calculated how the protected areas, that are these little blue squares or polygons that you see on the map all over the world. You can see there's a patchwork of protected areas around the world, are interspersed by fragmented and disturbed ecosystems shown in this sort of lime green. And the intact lands, so this darker green, this olive green, you can see mainly in the large wilderness areas of the Northern Hemisphere, or some areas in the tropics and temperate regions and in Southeast Asia. This review found that on average, only 11% of each country's protected areas are connected. So we are way away from achieving 30% at this point, right? That is going to be our goal. And in this wheel, what you're seeing is a summary of the percentage of area that's protected by country. Every spoke on this wheel is a country in a different continent. This is North America, this is Africa. The goal I want you to see is this darker shading. This darker shading needs to be at the edge, if not past the edge of this circle. And you can see that every country, bar none, has achieved that 30% connected protected area network. The reason I put this up is I want to show you where Canada is. Canada is there. Canada doesn't even have a bar on this clock of data. We are less than 5%. For the second largest country in the world, and with the longest coastline of any country in the world, we have a lot to contribute and a lot to do to contribute to the overall international goals and targets of the global biodiversity framework. So what I'm setting out to do is to try to increase that little bar there. And there are visions in the literature, and I'm not going to spend much time on them, but there are visions, one of them is called the global safety net, about what the world could look like come 2050, where we have not only created 30% protected areas here shown in these sort of darker blues, but as you'll see, probably you can't see quite from the back, but there are these sort of tendrils or dendritic corridors that connect protected areas and other measures for connecting natural spaces. And so that what we would have created is indeed this reticulate net of corridors linking protected areas throughout the world. That's a wonderful vision. They did some simulations and they did some calculations to suggest that this is feasible. But of course, we need a lot of political will. We need a lot of resources, but also we need confidence in the science. So my talk today is going to have 3 short-ish parts. The first is I'm going to define for you a little more what is ecological connectivity. I wasn't sure what the audience was going to be and who was going to be in the room. So for some of you, this will be a revision, but for others, maybe it's your first encounter with the connectivity conservation science. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why it matters. Does it really matter in the long term if we break up habitat into these little patches? Is it equal? Could you just have lots of little patches equal to one big continuous patch? Does it matter how you break up habitat? And I'm going to talk about something called the biodiversity debt in that context. And then in part 3, I'm going to show you the work that I've been doing for about 15 years now with the provincial and federal governments of Canada to try to mobilize that knowledge, the research that we've done here at McGill in the Department of Biology, into policy, and how we've tried to make that, to bridge the sort of academic research findings to decisions on the ground. So what is connectivity? So I've kind of alluded to this idea that connectivity is something to do with how easy it is for organisms to move around a landscape or a seascape. If it's a coastline we're thinking about. Here you're seeing a cartoon of a landscape, right? And when we talk about animal connectivity, we tend to mean something about whether the movement of species, whatever they are, whether that's insects or microbes or birds or mammals, we're talking about how unimpeded their movement is. How easy is it for an organism to move from point A to point B during its life cycle, during its daily foraging, across generations, over time? Those are all ways of quantifying what we mean by connectivity at different scales from the perspective of different species. And it's really important to understand that there is a difference between something we call structural connectivity. That might mean the distance between one forest patch to another forest patch. How far must an animal cross? Versus the functional connectivity, which is the point from the point of view of the species. How is that species exploring that landscape? How easy is it for that butterfly to traverse this transformed human landscape? And we can think about defining connectivity at the scale of an entire landscape. And that is the extent to which a landscape facilitates movement. That is an emergent and dynamic outcome of all the movements and all the flows in the system. And when I mean flows, obviously we mean something more than individuals moving from point A to point B. We also mean how energy, how matter, that could be dead organic matter, how it could be living matter, it could be nutrients. All sorts of things are flowing at any one time in the landscape. We don't always see those things, but all ecological processes are movements, are fluxes. This is a very fundamental description of nature and understanding of nature, and yet we have really not advanced our understanding of how important movement and flows are to the long-term assistance of ecological systems. And this is true not only in ecological time, but also in evolutionary time, where we know that gene flow determines how well adapted species are to change and how they evolve over time under human pressures. And so there's some French here lurking, where this is, as you'll see, this is a cartoon I use to explain the core concepts to scientists in the ministry of the Quebec government. So we can identify things like corridors, which is the same word in English as it is in French, but we can talk about faunal passages, the way that engineers might modify the barriers that roads or other barriers might represent to movement. And we can identify these nodes in a network and start to apply network science. And I'm going to come back to it. And so when we think about quantifying landscape level connectivity, I said to you that it was the sort of this emergent process of how the structure and the configuration of habitats and land uses on a landscape modify the flows of things. So one can imagine and compare two contexts where flows are unconstrained by the underlying vegetation or land cover, and cases where it's heavily constrained by the way that maybe humans are modifying the landscape. And so really the art of connectivity science is figuring out what these shapes of flow might look like, how fast the flows are, what the configuration of those flows are, and are nodes of important habitat sufficiently well connected by those flows. That's about as simple as we can make it. So what we're trying to do is assess these arrows, which tell you that, like, if you go back to sort of early math, they're sort of these vectors, these lines of flow that tell you how easy it is for an organism to move. Now, I want to give you a real concrete example. You're going to see data collected for the grey wolf in the Northwest Territories, and you're going to see the days elapse. And those yellow arrows are the movement of an individual of a grey wolf over the course of 2 months. And those lines are tens of kilometers in their longest distance. So what you're seeing is that every organism is exploring its environment. And it's required to explore that environment to gather resources, to mate, to find shelter, to do the things that an organism does when it establishes its home range, establishes a territory, or maybe over time moves and shifts its territory and its home range to respond to threats. So connectivity science, that movement I was telling you about, is not so straightforward. I challenge you to predict where that wolf was going to go based on the earlier trajectory. And what's remarkable right now is we're seeing a revolution in our capacity to measure these movements. We can now measure the movements of animals from space, or using drones, or by tagging animals. Sometimes we put a collar on it with a little GPS on it, like we have on our phones. And we can, like we did for that wolf, we can track where it went on a daily, if not minute by minute basis. And so because of the revolution in this sort of these wearables that these animals now have on their collars, on their necks, or on other parts of their body, we can start to map for a whole range of organisms across the planet how movement is being modified by us, but also comparing those modifications to their movement to areas where there is low human disturbance. So we can start to contrast and compare how human disturbance is modifying natural movement dynamics of not just one species, but many, many species. And we're starting to see technologies appear where you can have an application on your phone and figure out, go and assess for a species that you might be curious about, how it might be moving in the part of the world where you're living. That is really very new. That's something we did not have access to even just 10 years ago. So it's transforming our science. Here I'm going to show you another movie. You're going to see now 20 years elapse, and the months and the days are going to spin by very, very fast. And you're going to see different colors representing different animals. So raptors, like hawks and eagles, seabirds, shorebirds, terrestrial mammals like the wolf I just showed you, and water birds like ducks, for example. So you'll notice, for example, there are marine mammals here that are sitting on the ice. That ice is shown in that gray. That ice is going to pulse as the ice retreats in the summer and expands in the winter. So you're going to see the annual flow that is easier to read with the ice expansion than by this clock. And I want you to look for the trajectories of, for example, these raptors, these mammals, the shorebirds down here. You pick your favorite beast and you pick your favorite color, and you'll be mesmerized by what you'll see. Look at how the straight lines that some of these raptors are making. Look at how these mammals in the Rockies are moving. Look at how the sea ice is determining the movement of marine mammals. Look at how shorebirds are pulsing across the North Atlantic, coming out and tracking resources. It's an amazing image, and it's just the beginning of our understanding of how dynamic movement and connectivity is for every species on Earth. And of course, we're worried about the collapse of sea ice extent in the Arctic. We're worried about the capacity of marine mammals to be able to move around and forage properly. We're worried about whether human disturbance in the boreal is affecting how mammals are going to move. And we're worried about the ability of seabirds to acquire resources in the open ocean. So not only are we discovering how animals are moving, but we're also discovering how humans are impacted. So let me just land some of these ideas. The way we think about movement, when you're walking or you're on the bus home, or you see an animal, you see a bird, you see a squirrel, you see something, think about the different time scales of which that animal is moving. So on the time scale of seconds or minutes, there is a path that animal is exploring. Like you see a squirrel and it's hopping from point to point. That is a very general idea of a pathway that we try to measure and quantify. And then over a much longer period, maybe days to months, we see that this path is just a tiny segment of a much longer trajectory that an animal is using to explore its habitat. And you'll see that it might spend time in habitats and then cross between two habitats. And then over the course of its lifetime, where an animal is born and where it dies can be defined by its movement path. It's rare that we think about life that way. You could think about your own movement pathway from birth to death. Some of us have crisscrossed the Earth. Some of us have crisscrossed North America. You think about it, and you think about the resources you've consumed, the shelter you've had, the friends you've made. All of that is the movement, the emergent ecology of your movement. And it applies to any organism, even down to a virus. And even plants and trees, they just move at different life stages. That's the life stage of a seed or a propagule that moves. Every organism on Earth is moving, and we can characterize the science this way, the science of movement. But I'm here to talk about connectivity. And so it's very hard to gather information like this. We had it for the wolf, especially for this time scale and spatial scale. And we had this maybe for some of that previous big Earth hemispheric image. But what we want to do is translate this knowledge of the movement into a prediction about how a landscape constrains the flows. And so what we want to do is translate an image of the surface of a landscape, where the habitat is, where urban areas are, where highways are, et cetera, agriculture, how that might affect the potential movement. So that's a prediction from the science, from the models that we might make. Then the observations of movement, maybe with collars or with genetic markers or whatever it is. And then with that information, with those layers of the cake, can we then make a prediction about how patterns and processes are altered by modifications not only to the landscape, but maybe to the biology, the movement biology, the behavior, the expectations of the organism and the information it's using to make a long-term prediction about that very first photo I showed you. How does human destruction of habitat and fragmentation of habitat affect the ecology and evolution of biodiversity? And to show you some quite recent data to convince you that humans do, in fact, impact movement, this is an amazing paper, one of my favorite papers at the moment to teach this idea with. So what you're seeing here is the human footprint, the impact of the human footprint shown on the x-axis, very low, no impact of humans, very high impact of humans on the far right. And you're seeing here an image of the kinds of change in human footprint from natural to partially modified with roads, to heavy agriculture, maybe intensive agriculture, all the way up to high urban impact. And what you see is that every dot is an estimated measurement of the 10-day long-distance movement of a mammoth. And this is data from all around the world. And every dot is a different observation of a different mammoth. So what you're seeing is, note the log scale. So every jump is a factor of 10. We're seeing 100 to a 10-fold decline in movement as you increase the footprint of human beings on the landscape. So that might mean in a natural state, they move 10 to hundreds of kilometers over the course of a week or two, all the way down to 1 and maybe much less than 1 kilometer, maybe just a few hundred meters. So now we have to think about, what does that imply for the ecology of that species and those individuals? Can they reproduce? Can they feed? Can they shelter properly? And what is the long-term consequences for biological diversity? So a sort of synthesis or summary of all this work leads us to a few facts. First, that 2/3 of critical areas for the flow of animals on land are not conserved. So that's irrespective of protected areas that I showed you in the first map. We're just saying, so our first approximation or a first guess, 60% of the world is now is not protected, is hindered by, because we're not protecting it, it's being hindered potentially into the future. Only 17% of the world's free-flowing rivers are protected, and 91-ish percent, 90 to 90.5% of marine species have less than 5% of their ranges protected. So we're not setting the stage to support the movement, the natural movements of animals and plants. Okay. On to part 2. So I've given you so far, I hope, a kind of 101 of ecological connectivity, what it is from the perspective of an organism and how the landscape modifies that and what it takes to measure it. Well, what does it mean? Do we care? I mean, does it have a lasting impact on biological diversity? And so for that, I want to talk to you about an idea that's being called the extinction debt or the biodiversity debt. It's kind of like the sort of the similar financial idea that when you borrow something, you have to pay it back over some period of time into the future. And so when humans borrow nature, i.e. we chop forests down or transform wetlands or something, nature has to pay for that. It pays for it in the form of this, what we call loss of biodiversity or extinction over time. So let's take anywhere on the Earth, but let's take our favorite photo for now and ask ourselves, how big is the debt in terms of the numbers of species that will go extinct into the future that arises because of this logging? How will species be lost from those two patches of forest over time? Quantifying that is quantifying the debt. And so I've drawn a cartoon here of what typically might happen if you go in there as a biologist, and let's say you're measuring butterflies or birds, and you go in there over time every year and you measure how many butterflies and birds you see in those patches. Typically what we see is two things happening. We see the loss, the decline in the abundance over time. And when that happens over a prolonged period, we start to see extinctions happening. That is, that species either die locally or they leave that patch. Similarly, we also see that some species arrive in the patch and they increase in abundance over time. And so there is a balance between losses of species and gains of species in every patch of habitat everywhere in the world. But what humans do in general when they create fragments like this is they imbalance the rates of loss and gain of species. And so in this particular cartoon case, what is the number of species in each patch? Well, it's just going to be the realized difference, right? Initially, we start out with 5 species in the system, and then we're going to lose 3 initially. Very rapidly, we go from 5 to 2 species due to those extinctions there. And then we've added 3 more because of the colonization. And so initially, we see no net loss of biodiversity in these fragments because the losses of extinction have been complemented by or compensated by the gains. But then subsequently, we lose 2 more over a much longer lapse of time. And so the net outcome is a loss of species. We've seen an extinction debt of 5 species and a colonization credit of 3 species. But the overall outcome is a loss of something like 40% of the species in the system. So this colonization process is about connectivity. It's about the capacity of organisms to move in these highly disturbed landscapes, and that movement to forestall the extinction of species that might happen in those patches. Okay, that's a cartoon. This extinction debt is a really important idea. And it's one of the things we think we can predict the best at this sort of high-level biodiversity outcomes. And so what scientists have been doing for about 25 to 30 years now is figure out the time course of extinction, how long it takes. This red line is showing you the number of species, and from the starting point before fragmentation, after fragmentation, how does that decay or loss of species happen? And does it depend upon the size of the fragment? You might expect big fragments to maintain their biodiversity longer than small fragments. So what was remarkable about this photo that I did not tell you at the outset is that it's probably the most iconic experiment in ecology. It was started in the late 70s by Tom Lovejoy and colleagues, and they negotiated with some loggers and ranchers to maintain these patches as an experimental site. And they had multiple patches in the Amazon rainforest, and in the late 70s, they set out to study the extinction debt. And they followed it over a period of 30 years, and they've gone back every few years and surveyed everything that moves and everything that doesn't move in those forest fragments to quantify how much debt there is to pay. What they found is that a fragment of 100 hectares loses 1/2 of their bird species in less than 15 years. So what you're seeing here is a time course of that debt for these bird species in the 1 hectare, 10 hectare, and 100 hectare patches. So that remarkably, we've been able to go back and quantify this rate of decay of bird species, this net extinction dynamic. And they were able to ask, because they had this experimental control on the size of the patches, they were able to estimate what increasing the size of a fragment you'd need to slow or halt the extinction debt. And so a 10-fold decrease in the rate of species loss so to decrease the rate of loss, requires a 1,000-fold increase in area. So we need to have big jumps in areas of habitat if we're going to significantly slow the rate of extinction. Now, this was part of the lecture that I had as an undergraduate. At the time, I was kind of frustrated that they hadn't really been able to assess the solution. How would reconnecting those fragments, for example, with a corridor of forest, change the rate of extinction and slow the extinction debt, or even avoid paying the extinction debt? We did it fast enough. So as an undergraduate, one day I was walking home from the pub, and I was slightly tipsy, and I was thinking about what would my research project be. And it was on that moment where I looked up on the roof of a house on my way back to my dorm, and I saw that it was covered in patches of moss. And those patches of moss to me looked like patches of forest. And that maybe we could use little patches of moss to emulate what happens in a rainforest. And I just learned that moss patches were indeed teeming with life, teeming with microarthropods, teeming with protists and nematodes and water bears and all sorts of cool organisms. And that maybe if I shrunk the problem down, if I created fragments like Tom Lovejoy did in the late 70s, maybe I could study the extinction debt in these isolated patches. But more importantly, I could see what happens if I reconnect those patches. And so that's what I set out to do. We set out to compare mossy patches that were either isolated, contiguous large patches of moss, or we had these configurations that were very simple networks of 4 habitats that were either connected by continuous moss or were broken. And having this treatment allowed us to compare the effect of connectivity per se over and above the effect of, for example, of having a bigger area versus a smaller area. And it should be said that the total area of these smaller patches is equal to the total area of that bigger patch. And so what we found, remarkably, here is a number of arthropod species. These are like 0.5 millimeter in size. So you can quantify how landscape configuration, how the shape of habitat affects the extinction debt. And what you see is that if you compare the connected to the disconnected landscape, we maintain more species. We have a lower loss of species in comparison to the continuous habitat. And that the worst case scenario is this truly isolated or fragmented scenario that we saw in the Amazon. And so what we're able to show, because these organisms reproduce very fast, go through many generations in the space of a PhD, and because there are many of them moving around in this landscape, we have a very natural representation of a much larger landscape. We're able to demonstrate that corridors, at least at that time, was one of the first demonstrations that corridors do slow extinction. And that connectivity is a crucial part of maintaining diversity when we fragment habitat. Since then, we've synthesized knowledge across as many fragmentation experiments and connectivity experiments as we could find. And this is a busy graph. You only need to look at this one. How does changing isolation affect the ecology of an ecosystem? So what we found, if all the dots lie to the left here, we're showing an impact, a negative effect of losing connectivity. And so this is a measure of movement. Movement is impacted, it's lying to the left. Abundance, species persistence, richness, community composition, nutrient retention, pollination, trophic food web dynamics, and microclimate are all impacted by the loss of connectivity. So now we have, I would say, a pretty satisfying consensus from those who study the world of connectivity that it really matters. That goal A, those 2 targets of goal A of the Global Biodiversity Framework are spot on, that we do need to restore connectivity or protect it when it's there. I'm going to not talk for very long about this, but there is a world of models and math that try to transform, as I said, that structure of the landscape into models that allow us to predict the long-term dynamics of species, their persistence, their extinction, their colonization across a network of patches. and that we can describe those by sets of differential equations or any other form of dynamical system that we want to use in discrete or continuous time, and we can track the fate of every species in every patch. And we can begin to think about what it would take in the coming years to build these generalized models of connectivity that allow us to, that are parameterized by those movement data I showed you from the videos, and use that information to update our models and make forecasts of how humans and how we modify landscapes might change not only movement, but how in the long term persistence might change, or the diversity of a landscape might change. Gonzalez lab is busy with experiments and models. Here is Sam Gall, an undergraduate just last year, who was counting little springtails that are inhabiting these little habitats, these little plaster of Paris habitats where we had these little microarthropods, and we were challenging these microarthropods to traverse this very long corridor of habitat. And what's amazing is that we can go in and measure every movement of every individual, count them with a camera and using a program that counts rapidly and automatically all the individuals in every patch, and we can quantify the movement. So we can create a little empirical model system like our patches of moss, bring it into the lab or bring it into the phytotron here in biology, and start to parameterize those models that I showed you in the previous slide, to start creating a deep understanding of what it is that determines the long-term fate of biodiversity. And I should say that this work, I'm speaking today, but this work was not possible without a long string of postdocs and students who've worked tirelessly, sometimes laboriously, on counting many organisms or working with a computer simulation to try to figure out what's going on. And obviously the knowledge that we summarize in these talks is the sort of the result of all of this collective effort. So how much time have I got here? I've got maybe just less than 10 minutes to sort of switch to, well, what do we do about it, Andy? So you've told us a pretty gloomy story that humans are transforming the Earth's surface. We're changing how organisms persist and they move. None of us really like that. And most importantly, the UN Convention on Biological Diversity wants us to stop doing it. They want us to protect and restore connectivity. Some of it is a very cool engineering problem, where in Alberta, for example, we have put big formal bridges that allow large organisms to traverse the road and traverse safely and lower the mortality that arises from hitting a barrier like this. But of course, this can't be the solution everywhere. So we have to think about the long term, how we modify connectivity or how we protect it. So connectivity conservation is a thing. There's an entire IUCN group that's focused on bringing people together with the science. And they define connectivity conservation as the action of people, of individuals, institutions, and businesses dedicated to maintaining, enhancing, and protecting the flow of animals and processes on the landscape. So that's cool. There's a big community of people out there, and we're all kind of working on this overarching objective. It's leading to big publications that do global analyses of the land, connectivity on land. There are others that have done similar things for the oceans. And so you can see areas of high connectivity are shown in yellow here. And we're starting to have the computational power and the confidence to run big models. But we don't yet fully understand how valid they are. We haven't been able to overlay them with movement data necessarily coming from the organisms telling us how they move on the landscape. But most importantly, these big global models are done in a way that kind of averages out the scale of a region. When you zoom into a part of the world, what do we have to do to modify and protect connectivity at the scale of a region? So here is Montreal, right? We've got the Gaspésie, we've got the South Shore and the North Shore, the Laurentians, and on up into the Boreal and High Arctic. And so big NGOs like Nature Conservancy are kind of drawing by eye a map of the corridors they think are important. But what they are doing now is coming to scientists like myself and many, many others to say, well, can we turn these sort of thumb-drawn arrows into models? can we combine the data to suggest and prioritize where to connect corridors? So that is what we've been working on. And working in a way that makes sure that this little part of the world is part of a bigger solution. Right here is Montreal. It's part of a much bigger eastern sort of seaboard commitment to corridors called the Eastern Wildway. So a commitment at a very large scale, sort of quasi-continental scale, protection and restoration of connectivity. So what we've done initially in the early years, back in the sort of the mid-2000s, late 2000s, I was working with the Quebec government and with folks at the QCBS, we focused on quantifying connectivity. First of all, no one had really quantified how connectivity had changed in forest habitats in this area. We know that it's been impacted by big cities, by intensive agriculture. It's a very fertile landscape, and a lot of agriculture is being done here. What does that mean? What did it imply for biodiversity that was inhabiting these areas? And of course, the south of the province has the highest concentration of species at risk. And what does it mean for some of the processes that I talked about? The carbon that we store, the water quality in the wetlands, thinking about the flood control or other measures of benefits that we get from nature. Does the connectivity also impact them? And to do that, we came up with this workflow that allows you to take a land cover map, build in the biology of movement of different species, and from there, apply some network science that allows you to quantify the realized connectivity of the landscape from the point of view of a whole host of species, not just one at a time. And then the color shading here is supposed to show you how we might prioritize where to protect, what links to work on initially over time. We can't protect everything immediately. We have to deploy our resources in a way that's reasonable, and we have to do it in a way that makes most sense from the point of view of maintaining diversity and these ecosystem benefits. But the challenge, and I would say the challenge still holds, but the challenge back then was, how do you design networks for an organism as different as a snowy owl, a woodpecker, a salamander, a shrew, a white-footed mouse, a bat? They all move through those landscapes differently, and they require different habitats, different movement needs. So the question was, can we use this network science to define these priorities for habitat and corridors? So we came up with this idea. It took several years and quite a bit of funding from the ministry, working closely with the ministry to come up with this workflow that I'm not going to dig into too much, but what it does, it reads from left to right. What we want to do is we end up with a map that shows us what to prioritize, where to conserve. And we want to do that from the point of view of a whole host of species, because we want to be representing biodiversity writ large, not just from the perspective of one species. So that requires calculating the quality of habitat, the connectivity of the habitat. And when you know that information for all the species, you have a map for every species that we can then use to prioritize where to protect today. But what about tomorrow? For tomorrow, if we want to protect and make sure that the network that we have today still works in 2100 or 2050, we need to make sure that it's consistent and still protected when we have land use change into the future under urban or agricultural development. And so we simulate the future of these landscapes. And then we also simulate the climate to see if the region still has a viable climate for these species, and then whether these corridors and habitat that we protect in this network will still be viable into the future and will still be producing those benefits. So I'll zip through a couple of these slides. What you're seeing here are, for an area in the St. Lawrence lowlands, here's Montreal, here's Quebec City. We can create these little maps that show you in green the habitat and the corridor needs of different species, from a shrew to a martin, to a salamander, to a wood frog, and down to a black bear. Very different organisms that see the same landscape very differently. And then we can project land cover, how the city of Montreal or Trois-Rivières or Quebec is going to expand out over the next century, and how that might impinge on connectivity. And then play a movie, a projection from a model of how connectivity might change over the coming century from the perspective of any one of those species that we might care about. And so the darker the blue, the less mobile there'll be, the more resistance in the landscape, and the brighter the color, the easier the flow for that organism over time. So these are the kinds of maps that and these projections that we're giving to the ministry to help them prioritize where to protect habitat. And this is a little pretty cool interface, a user interface that Guillaume Larocque at the QCBS developed to show you, to visualize what these models show you in terms of the movements of different species. So the user is clicking black bear or wood frog, and you're able to see these little vectors, these little lines are showing you how easy it is for a typical individual to move in that particular location. And we can zoom right into, for example, Mont Saint-Hilaire. So McGill's at the Gold Reserve that McGill maintains. There it is. So you can go into the fields, go into the forests, and figure out what is the potential for movement in these landscapes, and think about working with local landowners, local NGOs to sort of build the network up from the ground up. So not just working with these big WWFs or Nature Conservancy, but working with the local actors on the landscape to figure out how they can contribute to protecting connectivity. And when you do the science, it's not looking awesome. So business as usual in this landscape. If you look here from 2010 to 2110, so over the next century, this is the expected change in connectivity. So anything negative is a decline in connectivity from 0 where we are today for every species. So each line here is showing you a different sub-region of the ecoregion that we live in. This is an ecoregion the size of Switzerland. And each sub-region varies in its human footprint. Some have very high human footprints, not surprisingly, the orange area where we're living. And on average, the trend is decline. So if we do nothing, connectivity is going to be eroded. There are some areas where we may, because of climate or because of shifting in living conditions in those areas, we might see a weak increase. But the bottom line, the message that I'm giving to the government is that if you don't do anything, it's not going to get better. We can't have a laissez-faire attitude to connectivity. And so then we try to quantify for them what it means to protect. And so, for example, here is a quote from one of our reports: protecting and restoring 17% of the most connected forests today, so the focus is on forest connectivity, will maintain 72% of the connectivity in 2050. So we're showing you how an investment in a modest conservation target can do a good job of maintaining connectivity, at least 3/4 of the connectivity. That's not 100% of the connectivity. There's still going to be loss. So maybe we have to go to 30% under the new targets of the GBF, and maybe we can maintain a higher percentage. Or if we want to increase connectivity, we're not only going to have to protect spaces, we're going to have to start restoring connectivity. So that is how the science has allowed us to turn a story of loss into a potential story of action. And we propose now movement corridors for each of these species. Every species has an ideal set of movement corridors that would best support it in the long term, whether that's a shrew or a bear. And then how can we pile these up? Can we stack these maps to produce a single integrated protected area network that maintains not only protecting 30% of the habitat, but it maintains the connectivity to ensure that it's a connected protected area network for the region that we live in? And then can we build it out for the whole of Quebec and the whole of Canada? That's what we're working on right now. And so that work does not happen in isolation. Sure, we can do it in the ivory tower. We can work in the Department of Biology, and I can do lots of fun, cool papers and things and work with awesome students. But really what we want to do is build partnerships. We want to work with governments, municipal governments, small NGOs, to create a kind of a network of connectivity conservation, where people and the science and the measurement and the conservation action is all interacting and coordinated. And so that has been really, for me, the biggest realization of the goal that I had when I saw that first picture back in conservation biology in 1993, was to transform that image of kind of forlorn hope into something that is pragmatic and gets us to where we want to be. And in the last couple of years, I co-founded a company called Habitat that allows us to work much more quickly in the private sector with businesses, in particular businesses, but also citizen groups, to try to translate the science that we've developed in the department and in the lab into management of maybe not spaces the size of an entire ecoregion, but at the scale of a town. And how can we work with local municipal leaders and NGOs to translate connectivity conservation from a map onto the ground? And just 2 years ago, at the time of the race for the mayor, for the new mayor in Montreal, we produced this dashboard to challenge the mayors to figure out how they're going to establish a protected area network for the city of Montreal. And we made it easy for them. We identified 11,000 sites across the greater Montreal area where they could go in and protect or restore forest. And for every point in that map, we showed them how much carbon was being stored and what was the potential to protect bird diversity. And so we've gone a long way now from kind of esoteric models of movement all the way to a very pragmatic application of how we can make a difference on the ground. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I've shown you the sprawl of our knowledge today, a growing understanding of how connectivity is changing in response to humans, and also maybe left you with a little bit of hope that we can accelerate the application of science to conservation to achieve that global safety net that I showed you at the very beginning. Thanks very much for coming.